Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this inaugural Pool Re Solutions webinar. I'm conscious of some people still logging in, but I thought we better start at the time of 11 o'clock. Pool Re Solutions, for those who don't know it, is an exciting new business division recently launched within Pool Re, the government-backed terrorism reinsurer. For those who are not familiar with Pool Re, we are the insurance industry's mutual for insuring terrorism risk in Great Britain. We were established in 1993 by the UK government in response to the untenable losses and uncertainty caused by the Provisional IRA's devastating bombings in the financial districts of London and Manchester. Pool Re exists to correct market failure, protect the UK economy, and safeguard society and livelihoods from acts of terrorism. We offer a financial safety net for around 2.2 trillion of assets and businesses of all sizes, and we have a sizable reserve fund of about £10 billion built up over 27 years by investing insurers' premium contributions in preparation for the unthinkable. At the heart of Pool Re Solutions is a team of experts, many with decades of experience of the insurance sector, terrorism risk awareness, risk modelling and risk management space. And we provide our clients with the knowledge, experience, tools and information they need to understand, manage and mitigate against terrorism risk. For our first webinar, we are very privileged to have two experts in terrorism and risk management, Professor Andrew Silke and Chris Holt. Andrew and Chris are going to share their thoughts and experiences on the impact of COVID-19 is having on terrorism and what mitigations are now needed to protect our economy, businesses, and society. Before I introduce them, a few words on today's format. I will ask both Andrew and Chris to speak for 6 or 7 minutes before moving on to Q&A. The formal part of the webinar will finish at 11:30, but if you have time, we'd be delighted if you wanted to stay on for another 15 minutes of Q&A. We will be recording this webinar and we'll be publishing it on our website. Please do ask questions through the button at the bottom of the panel, and so that I can collate those and ask them to our two guest speakers. To start us off, I'm very privileged to introduce you to Andrew Silke. Andrew is Professor of Terrorism Risk Mitigation and Resilience at Cranfield University, a post co-sponsored by Pool Re. He is head of Cranfield's Counterterrorism, Intelligence and Risk and Resilience Group, and is widely recognized as a leading expert on terrorism and low-intensity conflict. Andrew has recently published an excellent article on assessing the short and long-term impacts of COVID-19 on terrorism. This article is available on both the Pool Re and Cranfield University's website. Welcome to you, Andrew, and I'm delighted to have you on the panel, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks very much, Ed. It's a pleasure to be here, and good morning to everybody. As Ed mentioned, the talk I'm going to focus on this morning is based on an article which is available on the Pool Re and Cranfield websites, and I encourage everybody to have a look at that as well if you're interested in the issues that come up. The focus of today is very much looking at what impact does COVID-19 have on terrorism, and not just the immediate impact which it's had during lockdown, but what are the short, medium, and in particular the long-term consequences going to be of COVID-19 within the terrorism sphere. It's already clear that it's had a significant impact on terrorist attacks. And I think in a lot of trends, we're going to see a very significant lockdown effect. And I think the picture is mixed. So there's both, certainly in the short term, there's both positive and negative elements to the impact that COVID-19 is happening. I suspect in many countries, we're going to see a significant decline, short-term decline in terrorist attacks. And this is as a result of the lockdown measures which have come into place, which have, as we've seen in a variety of crime stats, a range of different types of crime have been pushed to extremely low levels. And terrorism, I think, is one of those types of offenses which is also being pushed to low levels in many societies, but not in every society. Tied into that is the way that terrorist groups and terrorist movements themselves have looked at the pandemic and have tried to understand it and have tried to incorporate it both within their ideology, but also within their strategy and within their tactics. And there's a very interesting dynamic taking place out there at the moment in terms of how different terrorist groups are looking at this. And I think it's particularly interesting when we look at far-right groups and when we look at the Islamist groups. And I think both of these sectors are the ones that have shown some of the most interesting elements. The far right have produced a great deal of propaganda in relation to the pandemic. As many of you will be aware, a lot of this propaganda is tying the pandemic into various conspiracy narratives that are prevalent within far-right ideology. And there's a lot of calls within the far-right narrative to try and exploit COVID-19 within this framework. The Islamist narrative, to a degree, is almost more interesting because the Islamist narrative hasn't embraced COVID-19 within its ideology, so to speak, but is more or less pitching the pandemic in terms of an opportunity that with governments distracted by having to deal with the consequences of the pandemic, that there's a window of opportunity for Islamist groups to strike, to reorganize, to engage in campaigns in violence while their enemy is in a vulnerable position. And so you get these two principal contrasts in the propaganda which is out there at the moment. One is tying the pandemic into conspiracy narratives, and the second is this is a good time to strike. Everyone is distracted. Everyone is the attention is focused elsewhere. We can make a bit of a comeback. We can strike now. I think the other concern that we have in terms of the propaganda side is that we've also seen an increase in online activity across the spectrum of different terrorist groups during the pandemic. And this is an inevitable consequence of people being locked at home with their computers, with their laptops, with their phones and surfing the net. But we've already seen in a variety of studies that accessing extremist material has increased. There's been a more engagement of it, and it has been more prevalent in a variety of circles. Now, that hasn't necessarily translated into an immediate increase in attacks in the real world. And again, under lockdown conditions, that's probably not too likely. But I think one of the concerns that we have in the short to medium term is how will this factor into radicalization trends? And one of the concerns that a lot of people have is that we're going to see an increase in radicalization as a result of this, with an increase in the number of people who are attempting to join these type of movements or who are more sympathetic and supportive of them. And so that we can get a knock-on impact in terrorism trends, possibly not immediately, but looking more in the medium term to the next 6 months, to next year, to what will happen there. The main concern I think we have in relation to COVID-19's impact on terrorism, though, is the long-term impact. And I think this is tied very much into COVID-19's overall social and economic impact. It's already very clear that the economic impact of this is going to be enormous. A lot of analysts are putting it on a par with the Great Depression in the 1930s. And if we're seeing that level of economic impact, we're going to see a whole range of very, very negative consequences. But one of the areas where we'll have a negative consequence will be on terrorism. Some of you will have seen recent reports looking at Syria, for example, where the economy is basically in free fall at the moment. And UN projections that people living at starvation levels are expected to more than double in the short to medium term, primarily as a result of the impact of the pandemic. Now, this is, if you want, reflects widespread negative economic impacts. How will that play out in different parts of the world? Well, one of the things I think certainly in the UK we're quite conscious of is what impact will COVID-19 have on government budgets and on private sector budgets in terms of the CT arena going forward. CT budgets, by and large, were protected in the aftermath of the 2008 and 2009 crash, and there were a number of reasons for that. But I suspect that the impact on the government spending is going to be even more severe this time. And there is a question over whether counterterrorism budgets can continue to be ring-fenced in the way that they were previously, and I don't think that that is guaranteed. probably more troubling is the impact overseas and internationally, and government's ability to spend money on initiatives and programs which are designed to support counterterrorism and overseas are likely to take a significant hit. We're already seeing something of a resurgence for Islamic State in Iraq and Syria and other parts of the world. And there's a question mark over what will the ability be of the international community to suppress this type of resurgence in the next couple of years in a context where budgets are likely to be significantly more constrained than they have been in the years up until now. Failed states are almost certainly going to remain failed states, at least in the medium term, probably in the long term. And a variety of vulnerable states are at high risk of slipping into failed state status. And I think this will give a whole range of different terrorist groups an opportunity to develop safe havens, to reorganize, and to reignite a whole range of conflicts which have been, if not entirely contained, then somewhat suppressed up until now. And on that cheery and positive note, I'll hand back to Ed.
Thank you for that, Andrew. Fascinating. I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions coming through. Turning to Chris Holt. Chris is the Chief Executive of CHC Global, an insurance intermediary and special risks advisor, and he founded the company in 2016. He's widely recognized in the London market and in the field of terrorism, political violence, kidnap for ransom, hostile environmental training, risk management and insurance. He has led the development of a number of award-winning industry technology platforms designed to leverage data to form a better understanding of complex risks. Chris joined the London insurance market in 2008 after an initial career in the British Army. Welcome to you, Chris.
Thank you, Ed, and Professor Andrew, a fascinating run-through of your paper, which I thoroughly recommend to everyone. And it's a pleasure to be here and to be able to provide some thoughts on the resilience implications of COVID, particularly when relating to terrorism. As we've discussed, Ed, from a resilience perspective, there are three broad themes that we've seen evolving. The first of those is organizations that we work with revisiting their risk assessment. The second is a move towards event or hazard agnostic resilience planning. And the third thing that we've seen is more cross-sector or indeed public-private sector coordination. I'm just going to take those in turn, if I may. So we are seeing organizations, pretty much all the organizations we're working with, revisit their risk assessment and in many circumstances really make an honest assessment of their risks, particularly those in what one might call the upper right corner, which does include a number of terrorism exposures. They're responding to this evolving threat and risk environment, but really the main thing we're seeing is profound and strategic uncertainty. One of the things I think from a risk perspective, and this was talked about in Professor Andrew's paper, is a significant uptick in malicious cyber activity. One of the responders that we work with has reported a 220% rise in cyber extortion in Q1. Clearly, most of the impacts are actually going to fall in Q2, and we think that type of rise is going to continue. Matched with that uptick in malicious cyber activity, we've also seen an increase in the vulnerability of organizations because of their changed work context. So whether that's around endpoint security or around the types of activities that are being conducted by those organizations remotely, we are seeing this increased threat from cyber along with an increased vulnerability. Particularly from a terrorism perspective, we're seeing the displacement of previous risks, and particularly around crowded places, some of those traditional crowded places are no longer crowded, whether that's transport infrastructure or town centres. But we've seen crowds displaced, so everyone will have seen the queues outside supermarkets, in car parks, and equally will have seen, for those organisations that are returning to work, the types of queues forming outside offices, or clearly those queues present an opportunity for the use of a vehicle as a weapon. But not everything has changed, and I think organisations are trying to determine which components of their risk assessment actually remain fundamentally the same and which ones have changed given the new context of COVID. So what we're seeing is people using tools as a handrail to make sense of this uncertainty. And actually VSAT, which is one of the Pool Re solutions tools is a useful way of doing that, and we're seeing people use VSAT and other tools to make sense of that uncertainty. The final thing I'd say on the honest risk assessment is that organizations are very definitely revisiting that top right-hand corner, which does include some of those catastrophic terrorism risks. I think it's worth us remembering that on the UK National Risk Register, the risk in the top right-hand corner was for pandemic influenza, not for pandemic COVID. And it's entirely possible that we could get something similar to COVID in the near future. So that's the first thing that we've seen, is organizations are formally revisiting their risk assessment. The second thing we've seen is this focus on an all-hazard approach to recovery planning, so event or hazard agnostic resilience planning, rather than a threat-specific approach. There's a really nice example here. There was an article in The Guardian that discussed it, of Tesco, who last year in 2019 ran a doomsday scenario without an underlying reason, but they just ran a scenario which said that their head office had been denied to them. Their chief executive made a quote saying, at the time people said it was a bit ridiculous and extreme, but as it turns out it was probably not extreme at all, and now looks extraordinarily prescient in terms of their ability to respond to what's happened in the last few months. Things that we're seeing our organisations that we work with focus on is plans to recover their key deliverers, so plans to recover people, infrastructure, systems and data. So not necessarily now looking at those threats and risks which they're identifying in the risk assessment, but to move to focus to the recovery plans so that those recovery plans are appropriate, whatever the threats and risks are that might present. People are also in this resilience planning looking to what extent their previous plans are complicated by their new working arrangements. So at the very basic level, we're seeing organizations practice their crisis management rehearsals using a remote working technology. Now, we've run a few of those scenarios with people, and I can tell you actually there are complications of running a crisis management exercise using remote technology, how a crisis management team and implementation team might interact together, and equally how one might have multiple teams working together in the online environment. But equally, there are some people who might be involved in the recovery plans, whether that's an IT disaster recovery plan or even an infrastructure recovery plan, who might now be required to do things at home that previously in the plan they were expecting to be able to do on premise. Finally then, on the resilience planning piece, we're seeing a real focus on supply chain resilience and this focus on the resilience of third-party suppliers. This requires an honest and robust conversation, both up the supply chain and down the supply chain. What's been interesting from our perspective is that previously there was an assumption often that larger organizations have better resilience, smaller organizations less resilient, and actually that has not been proven by what we've seen. Some larger organizations have not fared as well as they possibly should have done, and some of the smaller, more agile organizations have been able to respond in a more agile and flexible way. Finally then is this piece around cross-sector coordination, or indeed the coordination that happens between the public and private sector. This is good and healthy, and it prevents discussions or decisions being taken in a bubble. I think the question we've been asked most frequently by organizations is, what are others in our sector doing? There is a lovely quote we had from someone that we know, which is, there is nothing like a crisis to get competitors talking to each other, and we've certainly seen that. I think industry bodies have played an important role here, so whether that's people like the Business Continuity Institute, some of the security associations that exist, or even Paul Ree, who've provided a sounding board for people to speak to each other. And equally, we've seen a number of non-competitive relationships in the same sector form, and ad hoc relationships have formed in some of the major sectors to ensure that organisations can speak to each other and find out what's going on. There's a question there about whether those organisations need to be ad hoc or whether they could be maintained during a time when we're not in crisis. We've certainly seen increased discussion between key sectors and public sector stakeholders. So, for example, I was speaking with the Chief Operating Officer of one of our major food manufacturers last week, and they are still going on to the weekly calls run by a relevant government department. Actually, it seems like that they are keen to have those weekly calls on a continuous basis to be able to talk about resilience issues on an enduring basis, and again, when we're not in crisis. And then the final thing on this cross-sector coordination and public-private conversation is around the question, which I'm sure will come up on the chat, which is around when and how to return to work. So it's that balance of security and medical hygiene risks, and organisations really not wanting to be the outlier in terms of how they return, not just how they return in the context of COVID, but also how they return in the context of managing their security risks with this new changed environment. So I think, in summary, the main thing we're seeing is continued uncertainty. There is certainly the potential for the risk environment to change rapidly. And I think it's certainly possible that things may well be event-driven in terms of how organisations may have to respond to any security threats that could happen. But at this stage, the implications of COVID on terror risk management seem to be around these three themes. And that is that organisations are revisiting the risk assessment with the lens of honesty and really trying to ensure they don't have anything else left on the risk register where it's scoring with a particularly high score, but there aren't necessarily appropriate arrangements in place. We're seeing a move to event or hazard agnostic resilience planning around people, infrastructure, data and systems. And we're certainly seeing more cross-sector and public-private sector coordination. That's it for me, Ed.
Chris, that's terrific. And thank you both. Just first off, a question for Andrew's coming. Do you think we'll see a spike in terrorist attacks after the lockdown ends in the UK? And do you think this will follow the same off-the-shelf methodologies we've witnessed over the last 5 years?
Yeah, I think there probably will be an increase, but I think certainly if you looked at the developed markets, the lockdowns there have been more extensive and, if you want, more effective. And it's paused everything. And among the things it's paused has been terrorist attack planning. So plans which were in motion have been put on hold. And I think as lockdown measures ease off, then the planning can start to come to life again. And so I would expect for this year, when we look particularly at the advanced markets, we're going to see a drop off in terrorist attacks happening in March. It's going to stay in place during the lockdown. And then as the lockdowns ease in different countries, the number of attacks will start to increase. So I think we will see a spike as things return. I think there'll be a different dynamic outside of the developed markets, because one of the features there is that the lockdowns have not worked in the same way. And so as a result, they haven't had the same suppressing ability. And it's in those areas where, groups like Islamic State have been able to say, okay, look, state is vulnerable. We can strike now, we can reorganize. And so I think what we're actually seeing there is an increase in terrorist attacks during the pandemic, so we're going to see this difference, I think, between developed markets and then the rest of the world.
Thank you, Andrew. And another one, just as a quick answer on this. Do you think COVID-19 means we might see an increased risk of bioterrorism and potentially other novel technologies?
Well, I mean, bioterrorism, the threat of it has been around for a long time. Certainly, if you look at what harm COVID-19 has had, it's been absolutely catastrophic, both in terms of the number of people killed, but also in terms of the economic impact. It's just it's staggering, and that's still playing out. So for a lot of terrorist groups looking at this, they're going to say, well, if we want to cripple the economy of a state adversary, this is a good way to do it. The challenge you have is that bioterrorism is not easy to do. It's tough to do. There are a lot of obstacles you have to overcome if you want to achieve it, and that remains the case. So I think this might flag up, hey, this is something we should look at, but there are still serious obstacles in place to do it on a big scale. Smaller stuff, ricin, anthrax, that type of stuff is easier to do, and we see people playing around with that a lot. But using the kind of the if you want the COVID type diseases, that is much more difficult. Will we see people examining it more? Probably. Will we see successful attacks? That's much less certain.
Great, thank you, Andrew. And switching over to Chris in the last sort of 3 or 4 minutes before we go to that informal piece I talked about. Can you just expand on what sort of particular best practice you've seen with regard to return to work planning?
Yeah, I think, so the thing I would say is that there's not one size fits all, Ed. And I think organisations are accepting that there is complexity here. So that there isn't any ability to provide absolute certainty, and I'm not an HR professional, but there are clearly some HR and liability issues here around obligation to return to work, risks on the commute, particular specific issues with individuals who might have health risks. However, we are seeing organisations who are having to accept that, as I say, there is no single best practice way. We need to reflect the circumstances of location, sector, staff profile, and the impact assessments. And I think that the main thing we've seen organisations do is use duty of care as something they can use to test their appetite. Organisations need to take a long-term view. This might not be, we're coming out of a lockdown now. It might not be the last lockdown we go into. And I think considering long-term liability implications is also something that certainly we've seen conversations around. A lot of organisations are putting people into pods or groups, a bit like we see in schools where people are working together in a particular group. And that seems very sensible. The risk with that, of course, is that if you do put people in a group or a pod and one person becomes infected, then you do need to plan on the assumption that you're going to lose that entire pod or group at some point, which means that there's a complex planning system that one needs around when those people come in, when they leave, where there's interaction between the pods. There is an evolving situation, I think, around some of the technology and medical solutions. So there are some high-tech solutions being offered for example, temperature monitoring entrances, and there are also some private testing, which is available. This is a really interesting area, and again, I don't claim to be a medic, but when we've sought advice from what we believe are credible medical experts, the message we've had is that actually the situation is much more complex than perhaps the narratives being offered by some of those vendors. I'm sure many of them are absolutely fantastic, but this is a complicated situation, and certainly the advice that we've been provided with is that the NHS and government advice is robust, and from a liability perspective, it's likely to be the advice that ultimately manages to allow an organisation to protect its liability. And then the final thing on best practice around return to work is around outsourcing. So we're seeing some really novel outsourcing solutions. So one organisation is looking to move most of its office operations outside of the square mile and into the regions, because it's identified that people live more in that particular direction. So the outsourcing is certainly something that's allowing return to work to happen in a different way.
Thank you, Chris. And I'm going to break with what we planned to do, which was to sort of draw the formal piece to a close in a couple of minutes and just carry on till 11:45. I noticed we haven't lost any participants yet, and remind you for those you do have to go on that this will be recorded. So, and we've got a lot of questions which have come through as well. So, Chris, if I just come back to you again, please. Can you sort of say what the implications, and keep this brief if you can, we need a lot to get through, is what are the implications for security and resilience as we return to the new normal with the headline issues?
Yeah, okay, so new normal is likely to be different. So not all city workers are returning in the short term. So we've got that increased vulnerability on networks. So we're expecting cyber to still rise, not fall. I think the insider risk is increasing and potentially significantly increasing in those vulnerable sectors. Third-party suppliers, we think that reliance on resilience in third-party suppliers is going to be key, and we're seeing increased scrutiny both up the supply chain and down. And then I think from a hard security perspective, there are some real challenges about how one extends hard security issues into people's homes, if that's where people are going to be. How do you manage the sharing of a printer between somebody working in a sensitive role and their family? So it comes back to this point around return to work and what new normal is going to be. And I don't think it is going to be like it was before. And this comes back to, let's make sure we do a risk assessment and identify how we manage the security risks going forward.
Okay, thanks. And Andrew, this is a question from Jeff Moore, who's focusing really on the hotel and tourist attacks in the Maldives by IS-connected terrorists. And they were saying that they were taking advantage of COVID-19 crisis. Do you think, his question is, do we think there's going to see a possibility of return of a sort of Mumbai-style attack by any types of these groups in the coming year?
Yeah, that's absolutely possible. And I think that case of Islamic State inspired people trying to exploit the vulnerability is exactly the case. When we look at the Islamist groups, they do view this as a vulnerable period, a window of opportunity, and they are encouraging people to carry out attacks right now. I think those attacks are largely being carried out outside of the advanced markets, and that's likely to continue. We know certainly in Europe and in North America, one of the big concerns is this kind of marauding gun attack ever since Mumbai, and it's always been high on the agenda in terms of a reasonable worst case scenario for a terrorist attack, and that remains the case. The challenge in some countries, such as the UK, has been for terrorists to get access to the firearms needed to carry this out. I suspect the UK is still going to remain a difficult arena for them to get firearms, but other parts of the world much less so. And I think particularly, the tourism sector is going to take an absolute hammering this year from COVID, and attacks like this will just help further drive the sector to its knees.
Great, thanks, Andrew. And Chris, turns you a question from Rory McCrittrick about kidnap for ransom.
Yeah.
You think this is going to be impacted in the medium to long term following COVID-19?
It's a really good question. So, been lucky enough to speak to all three of our larger responders in the last month or so. So, we've seen KNR traditional kidnap numbers down in the first 2 quarters of the year. I think that's not surprising, given that there's been a significant reduction in travel. So, that intersection of international travellers and those who are looking to prosecute that type of attack has reduced. We think that's not unlikely to be, sadly, a permanent reduction. We think once travel restarts again, we'll see that increase. I think it's been fascinating looking at the business model of organised crime. So we've seen a displacement of their activities from the physical to the cyber. So we've seen, as I said, a corresponding significant increase in cyber extortive events. And I'm not really sure whether we're going to see a corresponding reduction of that cyber extortion once the business of physical kidnap is back up and running. Taking the kidnap for ransom almost insurance line and looking at the broader risk associated with that peril line, one of the things that we are seeing both insurers and organisations plan for is the kind of political evacuation type problem. So it is possible that we may have a false start. So it's possible that we might start travel back into frontier markets, emerging markets, and then that subsequently we might see the kind of geopolitical pressures based on secondary and tertiary impacts of COVID creating instability in those countries, and then us having to mount some kind of political evacuation. So it is a fascinating situation at the moment through the lens of KNR. Lower numbers at present, but certainly the response consultants, I can tell you, are very busy. Significant increase in cyber, which we don't think is going to reduce at the end of it. And then this complexity around what's it going to look like for organisations when they get back to full-scale international travel. I would say clearly there's a number of organisations that have still got people, because they have to, expats working in hostile and non-permissive environments. And for them, the risk simply hasn't changed.
Thank you for that. And Andrew, a question from Killian Walsh. And you talked about resources and the drawing away of counterterrorism resources. His question is more specific. Do you think there'll be a reduction in counterterrorist operations in the developing world, i.e. in the Sahel or Somalia and elsewhere?
Yeah, I think if you're going to take one rock solid prediction going forward, it's going to be that there is going to be a reduction, and it's going to be massive. And I think we need to already start thinking about the consequences of this. Those of you who will have heard President Trump's speech at the West Point, recently, he was making it very clear he doesn't see, he wants to draw down US international military commitments overseas. And that's going to be across the board as the economic impact of COVID bites, and it's going to bite really hard. Governments are going to look to cut spending, and one of the places where you're going to want to make those cuts is this type of international intervention overseas. So I think places like North Africa, the Middle East, parts of Asia as well, you're going to have a drawing back of the commitments there. And that's going to have consequences. And I mean, Islamic State, we're already seeing something of a resurgence. We'll see how that plays out. But there will be a variety of other groups Boko Haram, maybe Al-Shabaab as well, who will basically view this rightly as a period of recovery where they can reorganize and try and get their act together and relaunch campaigns of violence. So I think for me personally, that's probably the biggest negative that we're looking at in the next 3 to 4 to 5 years.
And if I may follow up on that, Andrew, I mean, what are the consequences if we have increasing failing states and the consequences of more terrorist attacks in advanced markets and in the UK in particular, which is clearly where Paul Rees are focused on?
Yeah, I mean, the concern we have is what is the link between, let's say, rising levels of terrorism outside of the advanced markets? What impact does that have within the advanced markets? And we know from when Islamic State was at its height and had a very sophisticated kind of a propaganda operation in place, that this did feed into radicalization in the advanced markets, an increasing number of people becoming involved in extremism, and this is the concern, that the two are connected. You can't look at an appalling situation overseas and say that's not going to have an impact on us. It probably will have an impact on us. I think the sad news is that most of the people who are going to be killed are going to be killed outside of the advanced markets. That's where most of the harm is going to happen. But it does have an impact, and it does feed into violence within the advanced markets as well, although the type of violence tends to be different. But we can't expect to see parts of the world descend into chaos and think that that's not going to have a knock-on consequence for us. It will. It may take a little bit of time, but we will feel the pain of that too.
Yeah, thank you for that, Andrew. Chris, coming back to you, and you're someone who's closely involved with the sort of data and the global terrorism database. I'm just wondering what the data is starting to show us on the environment at the moment, and are we seeing a change in frequency and severity of those attacks? And that's come from Jessica Riley.
Thanks, Jessica. Thanks, Ed. The simple answer at the moment is that from a GTD perspective, the Global Terrorism Database perspective, no, we've not seen a change occur. And I think this is where that balance between the kind of data collection and the type of report and monitoring that Andrew and his team have been doing is really helpful. I think we've certainly asked questions of the START team to look at not just the frequency and severity, but any shift in, and this comes to the point that Andrew was making, any shift in the type of attack that we might see in the OECD nations. So as you know, we work with insurers and model what the exposure might look like. So from an insurance perspective, we're doing this work on, putting in whether it's a large vehicle-borne improvised explosive device with a particular probability, or whether we're looking at putting in a marauding terrorism firearms attack with a particular frequency and severity. As you know, Ed, with the work that the pool has done over its years since 1993, you've mapped that change in event type, particularly from a UK perspective, from what was large vehicle-borne improvised explosive device to what we've seen in the last 3 to 5 years, vehicles as weapons, bladed weapons. So the key question that we've posed, I'm not really answering the question here, you'll notice very well, but what we've posed to the team at START is any indication at all that we're seeing a shift in the attack type that's likely to occur in the UK and elsewhere in Western Europe and North America. And I think, coming on to what Andrew said, anything that provides ungoverned spaces in geographically close proximity to Western Europe is potentially going to change that attack type, which is in people's risk assessment, which then drives that kind of resilience measure that we see. And I think what we're particularly worried about at the moment, and what we've asked GTD, and I'm sure Andrew's team are looking at, is anything that increases the likelihood of a marauding terrorist firearms attack, anything that increases the likelihood of us seeing small or larger IEDs on the UK mainland, and certainly anything, and you asked Andrew earlier, that might increase the likelihood of an attempted bio or perhaps toxic industrial chemical event. Those are the things that we're looking out for.
Brilliant. Thank you. Sort of last question for you, Andrew. And this is unfortunately somewhat anonymous, but do we think that the terrorist groups will have less financial backing and resource as a result of the economic challenges, in particular in those failing states which they occupy?
Well, every cloud has a silver lining. I think some groups will have less money coming into them. I mean, if you look, for example, at Iran, Iran's going to take an absolutely massive economic hit, and its ability to sponsor groups like Hezbollah is going to be significantly curtailed. But other groups, and I would say, you know, if you look at a lot of the groups that are active in advanced markets, are they're shoestring operations anyway. So they don't have big budgets to play around with, and they don't have a huge amount of money, and they don't need it. So I think we're going to see a bit of a mix. The bigger concern, I think, is that as you have regions descending into failed state status, where if you want, state infrastructure is collapsing and is no longer operating, that you're going to have movements and organizations step into the vacuum, and then they will tap into the resources which are available in those sectors. And you know, terrorist groups do not need a huge amount of money, relatively speaking. You know, they're able to cause a disproportionate amount of harm for a relatively limited amount of investment. But some of the groups, and particularly the bigger ones, Hezbollah, for example, Hamas is probably another one, are likely to take significant budget hits as a result of this, and we'll see what impact that has on them over the next couple of years. But arguably, Hamas and Hezbollah are not the groups that we're most concerned with, certainly in the advanced markets. And there are other types of movements, such as right wing, which is you know, much less dependent on an income stream than some of the larger terrorist groups.
Great. Thank you. And last one for you, Chris, and this is from Simon Harwood. It's quite a complicated one, so just a quick minute answer, if you may. And he's asking whether the government's sort of assessment of risk on a simplistic sort of XY basis, i.e. the impact likelihood of these events, do we think there have been some shortcomings in that? And do we think, and I think this falls in your field, do we need a more advanced risk assessment process, looking at cascade, public opinion, connectivity, risks, and everything else? A complex subject, but I know you'll answer it very quickly, Chris.
Oh, that's very good of you. Thank you. Thank you, Simon, for that. I hope you're well. It's a good question, and I think we could get drawn into discussing the various types of risk assessment process that we might use beyond the straight XY analysis of frequency, severity, or probability and consequence. But I think that would be to miss the point, which is that the failure hasn't necessarily been in the assessment of risk. The failure has been in the next step, which is using that risk assessment to inform our risk management process, and specifically that balance between risk mitigation and risk transfer. So, and the absolute example I would give is, you can go to the National Risk Register and on page 5, see the diagram that has pandemic influenza in the top right-hand corner as the risk. So the assessment was good. What's not happened is we've not taken that assessment through into the risk management measures, and particularly into that balance of risk mitigation and risk transfer. And I think the pool is at the moment involved, as we know, in this discussion around how the risk financing piece might work around pandemic concerns in the future. And I think if we were to do one thing, I don't think we should necessarily focus on rebuilding our risk assessment process. What we should focus on is embedding the risk assessment more effectively into how we manage the risk, so we don't have this cognitive dissonance of agreeing that something is a real problem and not doing much about it. And if you look in that top right-hand corner of the National Risk Register, most of those risks are malicious or terrorist risks.
Great. Okay, thank you for that. And just that concludes the webinar. And I'd like to thank Andrew and Chris very much on everyone's behalf for their fascinating insights. I'm sensed we could have gone on for longer, but we need to draw a close there. And thank you all for all your questions. And I note there was a number on cyber and critical national infrastructure. And that leads me on to our second webinar, which we'll be holding on the 28th of July, the Tuesday, same time, 11 o'clock, when we'll be discussing the rising threat of extreme right-wing terrorism and the emerging threats across the cyber terrorism landscape. We'll be joined by Comrade Prince, a former Deputy General of Operations and Deputy Director of GCHQ, and subsequently Cybersecurity Ambassador for the UK, and Eden Stewart, the Senior Analyst within Pool Re Solutions. So thank you very much to all of you, and I hope you found this webinar as fascinating as I have, and would welcome your feedback, and we will also, most importantly, get back to those who ask questions which we haven't been able to answer. And as lastly, please do look on the website if you want to re-watch this video, and by all means, please pass it on to other people. Thank you very much to everyone, and thank you again to Chris and Andrew.